Let me start by saying thank you for the invitation. I love an opportunity to be here. I know several of you, some of you I don't yet, but hopefully we'll correct that before all is said and done. That's not for me, is it?
No, you have yours.
Yeah, I was going to say. I could love both if we needed to. So, I am a former faculty member, so I can speak completely unprovoked for any period of time and fill the whole seminar just with words, but I hope that you'll stop and pause me and ask questions and things as we go so that it's not just me rambling uninterruptedly for 40 minutes or fewer or more. So I started to go with a full-on Hobbit theme for this talk, just in terms of graphics, because of the there and back again kind of, it just took too much energy. So I want you to know I thought about doing that for you, and then I didn't. So I want to kind of go all the way back to where I think theory begins for me as a grad student, and then kind of roll that forward to where we are now. And so I did some digging around and found this truly awesome. I'm just going to step back and enjoy it. 10,000 bonus points if you can identify the maker of this laptop. Does anybody remember these? This is a Toshiba. That is a floppy disk. That's a 3.5-inch disk right in the front there. This is prime. And I've got on my Netscape t-shirt too, if you can't see that. So. This is 98. This is just before I came to BYU as a student. So, as you think about taking your research and turning it into something that has some kind of impact, I think the first thing you have to decide is, do you want to have impact inside the discipline or outside the discipline? I think that, at least what I know about what we do in the department from when I used to participate in it more directly, and I still teach here. Some of you are subjected to that last semester from time to time. I think we do a pretty good job of preparing you for kind of making impact inside the discipline in terms of writing papers and going to conferences and writing grants and doing book chapters and the things that you do to influence the discipline. So I want to spend my time on kind of outside the discipline, like on impact out in the world, and want to draw that out through kind of a series. Most of them are quotes that I like a lot, that I've tried to pull into some lessons, and again remind you of the invitation to stop me when something drifts into the territory of being interesting. So, does everybody remember when this used to be the Apple logo?
The Zoom folks are not seeing your slides advancing.
Oh, the Zoom folks aren't seeing the slides advancing.
I'm not sure why.
Well, that is unfortunate, Zoom folks. I thought I was being clever. My screen sharing there. Wow. Oh, yeah, oops. Oh no. You have to look at my awesome paper. All right, let's see here. Where did you go? Okay, well, that's not going to work, apparently. Sorry, Zoom folks.
I'll zoom in on here.
All right. So do you remember when this was the Apple slogan or motto or whatever it would be? It just works. That's why you use Apple, because you plug it into the display, you plug it into the projector, you plug it into wherever, and it just works. And when you think about your phone, like there's a lot of stuff going on in your phone that you don't understand, you don't want to understand, you don't need to understand. You just want to, have fast data, and you want to listen to music, and you want to take, for some reason, selfies with the background being blurred out, but you in focus. I don't understand what that's about, but that's great. You don't have to understand all these things because your phone just works. And I think we have, we're educators, right? So we want to teach people about things, and we want to help everybody understand everything. And sometimes it's hard for us to wrap our heads around the idea that people don't want to do Bayesian statistics, they just want to make a phone call, right? And the idea of thinking about product is almost a dirty word for some of us, because product means that we've hidden away the complexity, we've simplified things, we've stripped out all the nuance, and all that's left is just something that's kind of a black box almost, and just kind of does what it does. But product is the only way that normal people interact with research, right? I don't know how many of you do Bayesian math, or how many of you data compression, or how many of you do, maybe you're interested in all the ML underlying portrait mode. But do we really want people to have to learn and understand all that stuff before they use their phone? And do we think that it's a bad thing, just like morally or ethically? Is it a problem that people don't understand these things, but they still use their phone? I don't think so. So when you think about rolling up research into a way that a normal person can consume and use as a product, is it, if that product is educational as opposed to being, a phone, now is it somehow immoral or unethical if they don't understand all the underlying principles, they don't have references to every research article? Like if there's a thing that just works, is that a bad thing? And I want to argue that it's not. And how many of you knew Vic Bunderson? Any of you? So, it's like 4. How many of you are older than 40? Okay, so that's basically who knew Vic Bunderson. So Vic was co-chair of my committee, and Vic just used to beat this into us all the time. The only way a normal person ever gets to actually interact with research is if somebody like you takes the trouble to simplify it, wrap it, productize it, and make it available to them. They're not going to read the journal. First of all, they don't have $40 per article to read journal articles, but that's a whole nother talk I'm not going to do today. Some of you know that's a talk I like to do. They don't have access to the research. They don't have the expertise to read it and understand it. And even if they could get the drift of what was going on, and if you haven't read the book, How Music Got Free, I would highly recommend that to you. But even if they would start to understand the math underlying all this compression, do they have the coding skills to go implement all the math? Do they, you just don't need people to understand all these things. We need to bring the research together in a way that's useful for normal people. That's what a product is. And a great product is one that does that amazingly well, right? So I think we have a tendency, especially in the education field, we have a tendency to kind of poo-poo products because they hide the nuance, they hide the research, they bundle all that up in a way that you don't have to be an expert to get the benefit. But I think there's a really important role for productizing research. Anything? Okay. Well, I know I can count on you. But
I assumed you were going to get to this, but can you give examples of some products that
sure,
would be?
Microphone.
Okay.
Look who's microphone.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
sorry.
use the microphone.
I was just asking for an example of some products, but he said he's going to get to it, which is what I thought was the case.
Yeah. But just as a family of examples, you're all familiar with the idea of the forgetting curve and spaced rehearsal and this idea that you shouldn't mass your practice, you should do it over time. So there's a whole body of research around that, and a lot of mathematics developed up around the shape of the forgetting curve and rate of decay and things like that. There's a ton of products that implement, either in flashcards or in some other format, that help you schedule your studying to try to optimize your study schedule based on what the research says would be optimal. Right, so that's an example of a family of applications that take some research, turn it into an app you download on your phone that says, hey, you need to study these 3 vocabulary now. It just pops up at 149 and says study these 3 vocabulary. That's an example of taking all that research and productizing in a way that you don't need to understand it. You can just install it and it reminds you to study vocabulary or study which country this is on the map or whatever kind of fact it is it's trying to train you to help you. Oh, anybody else before we go? Everybody saw, oh, who is that? Who is that? Going to Tom next. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where Gordon stated, but I guess one question that arises for me are, if products are the way that we wrap up research or wrap up, our goals and our philosophy and all the things that we've worked so hard on for a mass audience, I just wonder about the ethics associated with what we're wrapping up in that as well. So all the conversation around social media, for instance. So you mentioned Bayesian algorithms and machine learning to determine how to make a portrait photo, but all of the machine learning and social engineering behind like what goes on Facebook, right?
Mhm.
And so, I used to study educational games, and like there are implicit things that are happening in games that may not, you wrap that up for the end user, they may not be aware of it, but you can also manipulate people through the game, right?
Mhm.
And so I guess I'm just wondering like the ethics of wrapping that up so that it's now hidden from your user. So I mean, there's this question of do they have to understand everything that's going on in the background? Not necessarily, but do they need to be aware of some of the ethics of kind of separating those two things out?
Yeah. So I guess I would say on one hand, not forcing them to understand all the underlying mathematics or whatever it might be doesn't mean that you can't make that information available. Doesn't mean on the website where I go to grab the product, there can't also be a tab that says research that gives me links to every article and talks about how that research has been pulled out and brought together in the product. It just means I don't have to be an expert in all those things to use the product. But if I care and want to know about that, then I think we do have an obligation to make that available. I think especially in the case of algorithms, I think the problem with black boxes where there's nothing that can be audited, there's nothing that can be reviewed, it can't be challenged in any way. So if you haven't read like Weapons of Math Destruction or something like that, looking at algorithms that are used to determine if people should be eligible for parole or not, whoops, turns out there are some biases in those, and even though they're objective, they're nowhere near fair or impartial, right? So I think there is an obligation to expose all that and make that available and make it so you can have a discussion and a conversation about that. But I think as educators, sometimes we want to say, unless you understand all that, we want to put kind of a barrier in the way that says, if you don't come to terms with grappling with all these ideas, you probably shouldn't put your hands on the product, right? Until you can pass the driver's test or whatever that kind of qualifies you for that. And I think that's I think that bar is unnecessarily high. But there's definitely a balance to try to be achieved there. Charles?
I was just trying to understand why you thought product was a dirty word, or where you got the impression that some people think product is a dirty word. I mean, where does that come from?
It comes from many conversations with people who say
Academics? Or,
academics.
Okay. Like leadership at universities or faculty or?
I think it's really a specific pathology of colleges of education. So it doesn't matter kind of what college you're at. I'm going to talk in a minute about our allergy toward money. That's also a very local kind of pathology for, in engineering, the idea that you might take your research and spin it off and create a business. Everybody does that. Somehow in education, bringing money in any form and or creating why would you create a product? Well, because you want to be rich. That's just, you're on your path to money, and we all know that money is evil. So there are these kind of local biases or attitudes about some things that are just specific to colleges of education. I'm not just talking about BYU, but no matter where you go, as you talk to faculty in colleges of education. And I think there's also a pretty active, there's some active and pushback in the broader ed tech social media kind of sphere against products and against money because of the potentially corrupting influence money can have, and for some of the reasons that Royce is talking about on the product side where everything is hidden and there is no transparency and you can't see how or why or what. But if some of it has swung this way, I think largely our collective response has been to swing way far back the other direction. I think there's some place in the middle that we can carve out and work in. Anything else before we get to Tom?
I do have a couple of comments. Can I get a microphone? Sorry, a couple of questions, comments from the chat.
Thank you.
See, we've got product equals connotation of profit versus open from Michael. And then Kyle says, I'm sure many involved in the OER movement specifically have that view of product, not necessarily the field of education as a whole.
So I think it is the field of education as a whole. I think OER, the subfield of OER, maybe amplifies that just a little bit, where there's very much a feeling that that doing anything for someone else in terms of the way stuff is curated or brought together or packaged is trying to rob them of agency. But it's really interesting because when I don't make you pass a test on Bayesian math to be able to switch from a 3G to a 4G network, no one feels like I'm robbing you of your agency. You're just taking care of something complicated that makes my life easier that I don't want to deal with. And somehow there's a feeling that shouldn't translate into things like curriculum materials or educational technology products. And it's not everyone, of course. But I spend a lot of time and energy just kind of fighting against this sort of attitude. And I think it decreases the amount of spin-out work or product type of works that happens in our departments because of this kind of general feeling that product equals money, money equals evil, so stay away from that. So after talking about product, let's swing around to the other side here. I said I learned that first bit of wisdom from Vic Bunderson, this from Tom Reeves, that we need to stop focusing our research on things and start focusing our research on problems. Have any of you heard Tom say this in any of his talks at the ACT? Or he's been on this horse for a while, and he will show a slide like this, and maybe you'll see yourself in this slide, and it'll make you feel terrible, or maybe not. But he talks about research where we say, "Oh, I'm interested in 3D printing. Like I'm going to do research on 3D printing, or on virtual assistants like like Google Assistant or Alexa or something like that." And he's trying to get us to stop researching things and think about, not stop thinking about things, but thinking about how things can be applied in the service of solving problems. Like if we start from problems, then things will suggest themselves and we can use them in productive ways. But Tom has been on this for a decade, at least now, trying to get us to stop thinking about things and start thinking about problems and pull wearable technology into the fight against obesity or whatever that might be. That there are ways, it's not that we shouldn't talk about things or do research that involves things, it's that there's a means-end confusion. And as educational technologists, we love shiny things, and it's first-person inclusive. When I saw this list, I didn't see my particular thing here, but when I saw that list, this is what I immediately thought, right? There's only one item on that list. It's open educational resources, and I have been advocating in an almost problem-free way for OER for almost a decade, the first time I heard Tom talk about this. And so, for me, that had to go from saying OER, great, OER, we should all OER all the time, to saying, what are problems that implicitly I kind of care about because I think OER contributes to the solution to them. But once I figure out what they are, how can I kind of foreground those problems and work in that context and pull in OER in a pragmatic way to help me solve these problems rather than being obsessed about the thing. I still work on OER all the time, right? But now I work on OER in the context of trying to solve some of these problems instead of just kind of advocating for OER, which I did for a long time, and which helped me get many grants and publish many papers. It just was kind of not directed toward solving anything specific. Does that make sense? I spent time locked in a room with Vic, so Vic was able to beat his message into me much more quickly. I only see Tom 2 or 3 times a year, so it took me a little longer to kind of catch on to this. But I put this one right after the product conversation to say, what is a product? Product is a thing, right? So why do we bring all this research to bear? Why do we package it up in a way that we think it could be consumed by a normal person who's not a scholar of whatever? We ought to be doing that in the service of solving problems. That's what Tom would say. And I'm super inclined to agree with him here. Oh, okay. Any questions or comments on this idea of Tom's and how it applies, especially in relationship to the conversation about products not being evil? This is the kind of middle of the pendulum position, right? It's not all about product. It's not all the way over here, but there's some space in the middle in which we can create products for the purpose of solving problems. Yeah, you have the, and tell me your name.
I'm Matt.
Matt.
So I've had this conversation a couple times about this idea of like what directs, your research direction.
Mhm.
You know? And I'm very much in agreement with you. This is kind of my approach of like, what's something that matters and then build off it. But a lot of times I've heard also, like sometimes you don't know what kind of benefits the research, like, for example, I don't know the whole story, maybe this is just but how they.
Well, step into that minefield. Let's do it.
Like discovering, what is it, like the penicillin or whatever, how they had it wasn't like they started with identifying this problem. They were, I don't know why they were researching bread mold or whatever, but then it just led to that, and I think there's a lot of different examples of that where it wasn't this way, but it still ended up solving a problem.
Yes, so it's absolutely the case that it is possible to back into the solution to an important problem accidentally. I think you're more likely to do that if you start with a problem and try to attack the problem directly. Right, so penicillin's a great example of one way that we end up in a place that we weren't expecting to go. Happy accident, right? But the rate of happy accidents is probably pretty low compared to the rate of happy on purposes when we actually think about a problem and we go after it with energy and focus, right?
Dave, I have another question from the chat.
Yeah.
Tad is asking if there's a reference for the Tom Reeves quote.
There are probably many references for the Tom Reeves quote. I would say jump on Google and see if you can find the recording of any of his recent talks at AECT. He did a presidential session, and he did a TEDx when when AECT did their AECTX kind of thing. You ought to be able to find it pretty easily.
They can also find it, they look for, Thomas spoken of this in terms of
Microphone,
socially.
they can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, socially responsive research.
Yeah, socially responsible research. He's talked about it in those terms. So if you look for socially responsible research. Responsible or responsive?
Responsive.
Responsive, yeah.
Socially responsive research is the phrase he uses.
Thank you.
I guess I just wanted to validate some of the things that you were saying. I was in the business school and then came to the School of Education.
Oh.
And so, product.
And they let you in?
I know, right? But I feel like it could be easy for people that have grown up in this community to have a different mindset and not realize how different it is from engineering or business school.
Yeah. That's a perfect segue, which Royce is going to ruin by taking Steve. Just kidding, Royce, go ahead.
No, but I agree completely with this, but I do wonder if maybe part of the issue is just there is an implicit problem that educators kind of are operating off of. Like the implicit problems are poor educational opportunities, inefficient educational software. And so let me go look at 3D printing, look at online learning. So there's this, so it's not that there's maybe not an implicit problem that they're going after, but it's certainly not, the shininess of the 3D printer is what's distracting me for sure.
Sure, but I do think it's very much like, at least, so I'm not trying to cast this as a criticism of others, but my experience of this when I kind of ran into Tom's conversation about this was, I immediately went back to being a PhD student and proposing dissertation topics to my committee. They're like, that's a terrible question. That question has a million answers. Try again. What are you really trying to do? What is the question you're really trying to answer? And I think kind of attacking your career with an implicit question keeps you from being as effective as you could be if you'd stop and take some time and say, what is the problem I'm actually trying to solve? And sometimes I'll bring OER to bear on that. Sometimes I'll bring learning analytics to bear on that. Sometimes I'll bring behavioral economics to bear on that. But once I understand what the problem is, it's like once you know what your question is, then you know what literature is in and out of scope, right? You know what belongs in the lit review chapter once the question is defined. Once you know what problem you're trying to solve, now you know which parts of education or educational technology you can draw on, what you need from business, what you need from BE or wherever else you're going to pull from. It just scopes everything in a handy way. I can imagine an argument saying, well, when you scope it that tightly, that's going to keep you from having some of these other happy accidents where reading a book about, last year I read a really interesting book about scale. And part of it was about the biology of scale and why Godzilla would be impossible because bones would break and things like that. You can still read far afield, but if you know what your problem is, then in all the reading you're doing, and this is something that Andy Gibbons, I think, did a great job of modeling for all of us, the guy just read everything. But he knew what he was interested in, what he was working on, and the problem he was trying to solve. And so as he read, he was like, oh, that applies, oh, that applies. And he's just filling this basket of fruit, right, with things from these different disciplines, like like the stuff he took from architecture that he applied to instructional design and spent the last decade of his career on, which is brilliant, right? Because he knew what problem he was trying to solve as he was doing that survey.
I think one of the challenges, I don't know that I've experienced the products or bad things in the same way you have, but.
Well, try making a product.
Yeah, so.
It will accelerate your experience.
So I think part of the challenge, though, is that in making a product, there are compromises that have to be made. And sometimes people navigate that compromise well, and sometimes people navigate that compromise in a way that values personal interests, gaining money or making a profit over maybe solving the actual problem that they've set out to initially. So, I mean, you talk about the business school, and I've had lots of experiences where people have come over wanting to compete in competitions. Their primary interest in the competition is winning the competition, not necessarily solving a problem in a way that's going to be best for the people they're trying to create a product for. So I think it might be a more nuanced challenge than maybe we're used to thinking about it, because I don't think it's necessarily that people who don't, I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm just saying, I've seen both sides of it.
Yeah, we all have, right?
You, I think, as I watched you deal with the challenges that you faced, I think you've been able to maintain a focus on the problem, the problem that you're really wanting to solve. And part of the reason why you've moved out of, you've moved in lots of different realms is because it's not making the money that's important to you, it's solving the problem.
But it takes money to do
solve
things.
the problem.
Yeah.
But the making of the money is in the service of solving the problem,
Yeah.
and not in the service of making Dave Wiley,
Right.
Successful millionaire.
Mark Zuckerberg. Yeah. No, that one comment which I shouldn't make, but I will against my better judgment, is that as a society we're getting worse at compromise. You can just see it everywhere. And we're a part of everywhere. And so when you see someone who makes any kind of compromise in the service of taking a step forward toward achieving a goal, you can choose to see it as a step toward the goal, or you can say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that you abandoned principle Z, right, in that compromise that you made to try to make progress. And it's difficult to live, last comment about this, then I'm really going on. It's difficult to live in a place where it feels like it's a better outcome to have stuck to every single principle and made no progress at all than it is to engage in some compromise that gets you
absolutely
forward. And that's a broader problem, but this is tied up a little bit in that section. So another lesson: find the right partner. Partly for this exact reason we're talking about, in terms of common values and mission and culture and commitment to the problem you're trying to solve, you don't want to work with somebody who wants to make a ton of money any more than you want to work with somebody who's like, I want to get lots of grants. Well, that's interesting. Like, tell me about the grants you want to get. I don't care. I just want to bring in lots of money. I don't even care what. And it's all about, there are ways that we as academics can be all about the money too, just chasing grant dollars, not caring if it's part of a program or where it comes from or what it leads to. So whatever work you do, whether it's you're looking for a co-PI for a grant project you're going to work on, or whether you're looking for a co-founder to start a nonprofit or a for-profit with, you've got to find somebody who shares your values, shares your mission in terms of the problem you're trying to solve. But man, complementary skills is the piece I really want to zero in on here. So this is my co-founder at Lumen, Kim Thanos. Before I met Kim did her bachelor's at Boston and then did her MBA here and had been with several ed tech companies before and kind of gotten sick of the ed tech treadmill and started a little consultancy. I shouldn't say little, started a pretty successful consultancy she was doing where she mostly ran conferences. She helped organize events for people. And it's kind of the same story. Every person would come to her and say, conferences are terrible, they're all done in this way that's not very effective, and there's never any follow-through after the event is over, and I want to do my event differently. And she'd start helping them plan it, and then they'd look at it and say, oh, that's too far out there, let's pull that back in a little bit. That's too far, let's pull that back in a little bit. And then by the time it was done, it was every other event that you'd ever been to or seen, and there's nothing different about it anymore. So Kim got kind of frustrated with this and decided to do her own event. And she had been working mostly in the open source ed tech space, so things like Sakai or Wiley, if you're familiar with those, open source LMS, open source financial management system for universities. And she was interested in this crossover between open source software in education and open content in education, but she didn't know the open content space at all. So she asked her friend, like, who are some people that I could pull into this event? So I got pulled into the event because I work on open content. And so I spoke in the morning, and then at conferences, if you've been to conferences, there are frequently breaks, and during the breaks they set out soda or something like that, and everybody, or other places, they drink coffee during breaks. Anyway, during this break, there's just like a table, or multiple tables the size of one of these squares, just piled with warm chocolate chip cookies and big pitchers of ice cold milk all around the table. And I was like, I don't know who organized this event, but I want to work with them more and more. And I went kind of hunting around, and that's how I figured out it was Kim that put the event together. I'd gotten invited through a common friend who knew me and knew her. But that was actually, I was like, wow, milk and cookies, yes, let's work more together. And it sounds dumb, but that's kind of how that started. About a year after that, the Gates Foundation put out this Next Generation Learning Challenges grant. And this was about the same time that I was really starting to kind of absorb what Tom Reeves had been saying. And to that point in my career, I'd had, I don't know, something $7-8 million in grant funding and the journal articles and collaborated on grants with different institutions and things, but it had always been focused on OER instead of focused on problems, right? Like I was winning the academic game in terms of where my articles were going and the money I was bringing in. But Tom had persuaded me that I wasn't making the difference that I needed to make. And so this grant seemed like an opportunity to try to reframe and do that. And it turned out that Kim's values were very similar to mine, the problem that she wanted to solve. So this is kind of the one or two sentence abstract here, right? The idea of the grant was to do fully open general education courses across 8 colleges. I would wager that none of you have ever heard of a single one of these 8 institutions. Very small community colleges that serve predominantly at-risk students, with the goal of reducing costs for them and collaboratively improving course design. And those two things together hopefully would improve student success. So that was the goal of this. And that project went really well. and led to one of the most embarrassing moments in my life. So at the end of that project, which overachieved on its goals, Gates came back to us and said, this is great, we're going to do a second round of these grants, we'd like you guys to apply for a second round of grant funding. And we're like, okay, tell us more. And they said, well, we really want the things were successful in round one to go to scale. Like you did it at 8 colleges, that's great. How could you do it at 28, or how could you do it at 58? And so we stepped back and said, you know, the way to do this is to publish articles. Because we'll take all the things that we learned, and we'll document them, and we'll put them through peer review, and they'll go out, and people will read them, and then they'll be converted to all these great things that we wrote and the truth of all these principles that we found, and they'll go and do things. So we proposed to put up a website with a bunch of white papers and peer-reviewed articles on it. And the program officer from Gates almost literally just came back and smacked us in the face. Like, this is the stupidest grant proposal I've ever seen. No, that's not what we want. Swing and a miss, but you can have one more swing. Like, what would it take for you to actually do, you know, with 3, 4, 10 times the schools, what you did in this first round? If you can write that up, then we really want to fund that, so get your act together. Like, write a better grant proposal. So it's a heck of a thing to be smacked around by your program officer. So at that point, you start to realize that you have to make a choice. Because your impact is going to be a function of the amount of focus that you're able to give to the work. Right? So if you're trying to teach a couple classes and serve on committees and do all the things that you do as a faculty member, there's not enough time to do all the work that needs to be done to do what we did with Kaleidoscope at 50 institutions or more. So that's how I ended up making the choice to, Kim quit her job, she closed her consultancy, I took a leave from BYU and we started Lumen. And that's really all because of having this lesson beat into me by Tom that we need to be trying to solve problems, of not being afraid of productizing things because of the time I spent with Vic, and finding the right partner, and then finding the right opportunity kind of all coming together. So, how are we doing? What time are we supposed to end? 10?
In about 10 minutes.
In about 10 minutes, okay. So, you know, the 30 seconds about Lumen is, so Lumen has this kind of catalog of pre-curated, quite easy to adopt course materials that you can use instead of, am I dying here? Instead of the commercial textbook that you're using in your course currently. And depending on what you do together with Lumen, that might be $10 a student in terms of cost, or $25 a student, but it's not $150 or $200. And these look very much, in a lot of ways, like every other kind of textbook or other sort of materials or interactives or simulations that you've seen before. They're just all open source. So because they're open source, they're out on the public web, which lets you, have some kind of indirect impact. So last year we had about 44 million visits to that catalog of all the open content there. But if you look at Lumen by the numbers, it's kind of a team of 30 people in 10 states. There's a little over 50 courses on our catalog. Last year we saved students about $20 million, and all time we've saved them about $50 million. And it's this weird, windy road of not having weird feelings about products, and listening to Tom talk about problems and finding the right partner and things like that. So I wanted to wrap up with a couple of kind of rapid fire lessons learned that won't take as much time with any of these individually. Oh, I should pause and say, any questions or comments before I launch into the rapid fire here?
Just super fast, you've told me this before, but I don't know, it'd be good to hear it again. So you said all the stuff that Lumen offers is open, so it's free for anyone to use. So what does Lumen do that?
Oh, sure. So Lumen is training, Lumen is technical support, Lumen is tools that help you integrate the content into your LMS, Lumen is personalized and adaptive kind of wraparound features and content, alignment of content and assessments with outcomes so that you can do interesting things. But all the things that Lumen offers are all wraparound services around this core open content. And like 44 million people last year just came and got the open content and did what they needed to do with it and left, and there was never any exchange. You only pay Lumen if we actually provide service to you somehow. So that's what it's a kind of services-oriented business model. Okay, rapid fire. Oh, that window's unfortunate. Let's see. So first lesson is just stop being afraid of or embarrassed by or antagonistic toward money. So for the first 3 or 4 years that I was gone from BYU, I was really embarrassed by the fact that Lumen was for-profit. Like, I had a hard time, really embarrassed is too strong, but I had a hard time kind of coming to terms with this decision that Kim and I had to make early on. Would it be a nonprofit or a for-profit? And there are upsides to both of those, but at the end of the day, a for-profit has more flexibility in the kind of funding that it can take and the kind of support that it can receive as it's growing than a nonprofit does. And so it's just a super practical decision there. And there are lots of nonprofits in the world who charge the same money or more money for the same kinds of services that we do. So somehow it's not about the exchange of money, but just the idea of being a for-profit was hard for me coming out of education to kind of come to terms with. But I succeeded. We talked about this in the grant writing class, this idea that no business plan survives first contact with customers. It's true of instructional design theories. It's true, like, whatever it is, when you sit with other people at a whiteboard and you come up with a plan, and then you go out into the world and try to put that plan in motion, it never actually works the way that you thought it would when it was 3 of you at a whiteboard. And so figuring out how to iterate on that kind of rapidly turns out to be important. So for example, for the first 4 years of Lumen's existence, we had a policy that we would never charge students for any of our services. We would only charge institutions. And we wanted everything to be free to students. And then I was on a panel with a faculty member who was a Lumen customer, and we were talking about cool things that Lumen does. And at the end of the panel, we walked kind of down off the stage. And then she basically grabbed me by my shirt and put me in a corner and started screaming at me about this ridiculous policy we had of only letting institutions pay for our services. She was an adjunct who taught at 3 different community colleges. One college had an agreement with Lumen where they could pay, the other 2 didn't. And because she was like, why do I need the provost to sign something so I can adopt curriculum materials? Like, your model needs to be flexible enough for me to not have to go persuade somebody in purchasing to sign a contract so that I can work with you. And after being berated by her, then I came around to that point of view. And so now there are ways that students can pay the $10 or students can pay the $25 if the institution can't. Although our preference is still for the institution to pick up that cost. This might be my favorite quote I've heard in the whole time we've been doing Lumen. And this is just all about the importance of cash, right? That no business ever closed because it ran out of strategy. You've always got ideas that you think are great, and you think your ideas are wonderful, and there's strategy to spare. But when the money runs out, everybody still has to pay their mortgage and still has to eat and has to all go find other jobs. So it turns out that actually having enough money to pay all the people who are involved in what you do is really important. And you have to care about that, and you have to think about it, and you have to manage it and focus on it in a way that as a faculty member you're not used to doing. You're running a budget that's employing people, and when the cash goes away, all the people go away. A mediocre plan with excellent execution always outperforms an excellent plan with mediocre execution. There's not a ton of secret sauce in what Lumen does in terms of its plan, but Lumen executes really well. And not because of me, because of all the complementary expertise I was talking about when you go out to find partners, because there's an entire universe hiding inside that word. From everything, like from HR to hiring policies to the financial model to tax to hiring to, you have customers, they make contracts to pay you. You would think that they just pay you. No, it turns out you have to invoice them 19 times and chase them all over the green earth until they'll finally pay you what they agreed to pay you later on. There's all this stuff wrapped up in execution that to me, I just can't really bring myself to care about, except for the way that it enables the mission. Right? But there are other people who just like their dream, they wake up in the morning and they want to work on financial models. And so you need to find those people and you need to get them on your team, right? This is an Eleanor Ostrom quote: "Things that work in practice must be possible in theory." And just noodle on that one for a minute, because it's really good. Because this idea that you could build a company around something that's completely free, that anybody can come to the website and get and just use and not pay you, it doesn't seem like that's a thing that ought to be able to work. Like, it's hard to build the theory that shows how that can happen. But once you show that it can actually work and that it does work, then the theory can follow later on. But this notion that things that work in practice have to be possible in theory is great. This is related to that one. And I think the other thing that I've learned, and I have an example, but there's not time left for it, but universities aren't the only place where knowledge is created. That you can do R&D, you can build new things that are genuinely new, you can publish research articles when you work at other places other than universities. And I'll just give it a little nod because is Bob still in the back of the room? Bob was in the back of the room a minute ago. We've got a whole research strand running at Lumen right now on continuous improvement, based out of this paper that Rob and Bob Nyland and I did 2 years ago. And it's super fruitful and super productive, and there's lots of interesting stuff happening there.
Dave,
But I'm going to stop there.
can you use that microphone? Your battery just died.
Wow.
You have a chance now.
I know. Love. Exciting and new. Okay. So I'm going to stop there in terms of slides, but would love any additional thoughts or comments or questions about what I hope has been a conversation about extending your impact outside of the discipline.
You mentioned finding a partner based on cookies and milk. That seems pretty serendipitous. What advice do you give to have similar serendipitous opportunities ourselves?
Be as many places as you can be, meet as many people as you can meet. Like, it really comes down to that, I'm going to say these words out loud, and then if it isn't true yet, it will soon be true. Is there like Tinder for co-founders? Like, no. Maybe there is. Maybe there's some social networking site where you can go shopping for co-founders and swipe left or swipe right. But I would never pick a co-founder that way. But if you're going to lots of things, if you're involved in clubs, if you're involved in organizations, if you're going to conferences, if you're just putting yourself in situations where you can meet lots of people, and you know the kind of thing that you want to do, and that you know the kind of person that you're not, that you need to help you do it, then you can be on the lookout for that person as you're moving around at those conferences or events or whatever. But I don't think it's the kind of thing that you can say, today I'm going to find my co-founder and like go online and find them somehow. I think it's a very social process.
And you think that's the solution? So I've been wrestling with this throughout your whole presentation. So the expectation for faculty members is that they're not creating products, like that they're researchers and they're instructors, and sometimes the product of their research is their instruction, but even then it's a limited audience. So is the solution for faculty members or future faculty members who want to be able to take that research and productize it for a mass audience, is that the solution? Is that you just have to find the partnerships to do it? Because at the end of the day, that's really not what you're paid to do.
Yeah, you've got to do what you're paid to do, right? I mean, when I was a student here a very long time ago, there's a faculty member who none of you will know, who I loved and who was never around. Like, would show up for class 5 minutes before class started, would be the first one out the door after class, and had all these projects that they were working on. And I was super bitter about it. And as Kaleidoscope started getting better and things started taking off, I started to realize I'm turning into that person. I just can't be that person, right? So you either have to find someone that you can hand it off to. So every university, including BYU, has an Office of Technology Transfer, where they help you take ideas that you think could be a product, but you're not quite willing to quit your job over yet, or you're just not interested in learning all this other craziness about execution, but you think it could have a life on its own, you can work with tech transfer to help you find other people to help do that. And then the university owns part of the company. Well, revenue gets divided up between the institution, the department, and you is typically how it works depending on the university that you're at. But there are some kind of middle ground models where you can try to launch that thing out to have a life on its own. And there are kind of adults in the tech transfer office who understand the business part of it that you don't, who can help you navigate some of that and find people to help with that. And you can keep being a faculty member.
Hey, we want to thank Dave for coming and spending some time with us today.